What is something scary that has happened to you that you cannot explain rationally? Story 1. I live in a condominium and we own two apartments on the 7th and 8th floors. The only way to move between them is to step out of the apartment, take the elevator or the staircase, and enter the other one. One night we ran out of ice cream upstairs and my mom told me to go get some from the downstairs freezer. So I took the keys to the 7th floor apartment. Since it was dinner time, no one was there. I walked into the pitch dark and realized that someone was sitting on the sofa, so I flipped the switch and saw my dad just sitting there. It was kind of weird, but I just went to get the ice cream and asked if he had a key to lock up. No answer. I shrugged and thought, well, if he came in and locked the door behind him, he must have one. I went back upstairs and my dad was sitting there eating dinner. I freaked out and asked how he got up there so fast, and everyone told me that he had been there the whole time. I told them it wasn't possible because I had just seen him downstairs, but no one believed me. Now I never go down there alone. Edit. To clear up some stuff, each of our apartment doors is fitted with three types of locks. There's a gate with its own keyhole and lock. We added another lock, so you have to unlock this gate twice. Then there's the main door and its own lock, so you need three keys just to enter our house if no one is inside. I did get a good look, and it was 100% my father. He's kind of heavy and has a serious-looking face, so it's hard to mistake him. The apartments are not directly accessible because not only are they not on the same floor, they're not even on top of each other. There's an elevator in between, and they are on different ends, so there is no way for anyone to go up or down without first passing through the elevator or the staircase. Story 2. I used to work doing maintenance at historic properties. There was a historic house museum I worked at when it wasn't open to the public. It was part of a larger landmark site. There was a visitor center with offices, and the house was about half a mile up a dirt road in a wooded area. Sometimes I worked with a crew, but often I was there alone. One winter day, when it was really cloudy and dark, I was working alone to get ready to replace some electric work on the exterior of the house. I went inside and turned off the circuit to the whole property, and I tested it. It was off. I locked the doors and went outside to work. After about an hour, I got down from my ladder and started walking around the house, and then one of the lights inside turned on. I started to freak out, but thought that maybe someone was playing a joke on me. I called the visitor center on my walkie-talkie and confirmed that the only other person working that day was still there and hadn't left, and that all the keys to the house were present and accounted for. That's when I freaked out and ran the half mile up to the office. I made my coworker come back with me to check what was going on. When we got to the house, the light was off again, but the bulb was still warm. All the doors were still locked, and the circuit was still off. Still gives me shivers to this day. Story 3. When I was 6 years old, I had a cat named Buster. Buster was actually my stepdad's cat, but because I had never had a cat before, I claimed him as my own. Suffice it to say, Buster didn't like being hugged and coddled all the time by a little child, so he hated me. He avoided me at all costs. He was also an outdoor cat, so he would often spend most days outside and then come in for the night. One night, Buster didn't come back into the house. We usually fed him at night, so I was worried. Our area was also well known for an abundance of coyotes. My parents were being a bit hush-hush about Buster's disappearance, but I didn't get the hint. That night, when I was drifting off to sleep, Buster jumped onto my bed. He lay down by my head and let me pet him until I fell asleep. Honestly, I was shocked because he had never done this before. The next morning, I triumphantly walked downstairs and told my parents that Buster now loved me because he slept in my bed during the night. My parents looked at me curiously and sat me down at the breakfast table to let me know that while they were outside the night before, they had found Buster's body in the alley behind our house. They thought he had been attacked by a coyote, but he was dead, so he couldn't have slept in my bed that night. To this day, I like to think that Buster just wanted to say goodbye and thank me for trying to love him the only way a child knew how. Story 4. My family owns a decent-sized horseboarding facility, and when we first had it running, we used to do bed check as a family. Bed check is just making sure all the lights and fans were off, as well as checking the horses for injuries and if they had blankets during the winter. Well, we had just gotten back from eating out, and it was a moonless fall night. As we stepped out of the truck, this large light gray mass stood up and took off, loping toward our pastures. It was about the size of a single cab pickup truck. It made no noise other than the sound of it hitting the ground as it ran. The only other proof that it was real to us was the horses that were turned out that night. They screamed and stampeded across the pasture it had jumped into. We did a double count of all the horses that night, and not a single one was missing. I still have yet to see it again, and I hope I never do, or at least that there's some explanation for it. Story 5. When I was in university, I lived by myself. It was a nice little studio unit behind a house in a fairly decent area. I would honestly think nothing of walking places at night. There was a 24-hour McDonald's and a 7-Eleven that I would walk to often between 12 a.m. to 3 a.m. since I was a massive night owl. One day, after finishing an essay at about 2 in the morning, I decided I was hungry but didn't really have anything easy to cook. So I decided to walk down to the 7-Eleven and grab a pie or something. However, as soon as I opened my door, I was overcome by a suffocating feeling of fear. My heart started pounding. I began shaking. The works. Telling myself this was ridiculous, I walked out to the street with the intent to still go, but that was as far as I got. I was terrified for no reason I could understand. But the fear didn't go away. I ran back inside and ate dry cereal. Later the next day, I heard about a group of drunk guys causing havoc near the intersection by the 7-Eleven. They had beaten up someone from my university. Even though I can't explain it, I'm convinced something bad would have happened to me that night if I had ignored that feeling and gone anyway. Story 6. Probably too late, but here goes. I was working at a hotel in Albuquerque, the graveyard shift. I had been talking to the security guard and he asked if he could get a ride home. So instead of waiting 30 minutes for my shift to end, I just left and left a note for my boss saying I left early because my brother was stranded outside of town and needed me to get him. A total lie on my part, but I needed a good excuse to leave early. I dropped off the security guard at his place, then went home and went to sleep. After a couple of hours of sleep, I woke up to my phone ringing. It was my brother. He told me he was stranded outside of town and needed me to come get him. I told my brother the lie I had told my boss and how strange it was that he was now calling me for the exact same reason. He said, "That's not weird. I'll show you what's weird when you get here." I got there and asked him what was weird. He put his phone up to my ear and played a message he had received when he woke up that morning. It was a voice that kind of sounded computerized, but mostly just creepy. It said, "You're stuck." Freaked us both out. Never figured out where the call came from. Strangest, creepiest thing that's ever happened to me. Story 7. In my childhood home, I would often hear touch typing coming from the computer downstairs early in the mornings. I didn't think much of it at first. My parents worked from home, and it wouldn't be uncommon to wake up in the morning to hear Mom typing away at the computer. One day I got up and called out to Mom, assuming she was down there working, as I could hear typing. No answer. No one was down there at all. I was sure I heard typing. This began happening regularly. I figured I was so used to hearing typing from downstairs that I was imagining things, so I didn't mention it to anyone, thinking I was going a bit crazy. This happened on and off over a period of 6 months. The sound of fast typing and fast, furious clicking of a mouse, as if someone was frustrated. One morning I was eating my breakfast when I heard Mom at the top of the stairs call out to me, "You're not down there on that computer already?" I froze and ran out to her. I was amazed she had heard it too. She was convinced she could hear typing, yet no one was down there. I told her about all the times I'd been hearing it, and then my sister opened up about hearing it regularly too. When no one was down there, I wasn't crazy after all. I set out to try to catch whatever was causing it and to discover a rational explanation for it. I'd sprint out of my bedroom to the top of the stairs, where I was able to look down into the room to see if anyone was at the computer. No such luck. Every time I got there, it stopped. I think it went on for a couple of years, and we learned just to kind of live with it, as it wasn't every day. I was down there once when the ceiling light globe in the center of the room began flashing very fast, strobe-like. It then exploded, and glass went shattering all across the room. I was lucky I ran out of the room when it started happening because I was scared. The whole mysterious typing, you know. If I hadn't run, I would have been hit with bits of the light bulb. Around that same time, I was on the computer at home by myself when something happened that resulted in me never being alone in that room again. I felt and heard this really sharp intake of breath directly behind my right shoulder, near my ear. I've never run so fast in my life and was hesitant about going in that room ever again. Prior to that, the whole typing thing had just been something weird and a bit spooky, not scary. Still makes my heart race when I think about it today. I've never really encountered anything like this before, or since all those events. I don't particularly believe in ghosts either, but I'm open to the possibilities of something for which scientists don't yet have a proper explanation. Story 8. Pretty sure I lived in a haunted house for a while. Strange things. For one, I always felt like I was being watched in my room, and if I had the door open to the hallway, I would swear I saw someone walk by out of the corner of my eye. We had 2 cats, and sometimes they'd be in my room sleeping, and then all of a sudden they would sit bolt upright and stare at the door. Nothing I did could move them for a long time. This happened often. One day in my bathroom, the shelf that had my sister's beauty stuff randomly lost hold of all the items. The thing was, the shelf wasn't loose or hanging, and all the stuff had to bounce out of a 2-inch high lip into the sink. One time in the middle of the night, my sister's 100-plus-year-old dresser she got as a gift from our grandma just fell over. This thing weighed a ton and was built like a tank. My sister said she heard the sound of someone pushing. Mom and my sister used to yell at me for sneaking around the house. Only I wasn't home, or I was in my room. They said they saw a man in shadows who was about my height. One day we also ran into the old owner, and my mom casually asked the lady if she had ever experienced anything in the house. The lady started crying and said no one believed her. But yes, she experienced a lot of things. I moved out around that time. I do not miss that place. Story 9. There was a small door that led to attic space in my bedroom, ages 11 to 13, and it became a habit that I would shut the door as I walked into my bedroom a couple of times a week. I didn't think anything of it, just assumed my mom didn't close it all the way when she left it. After a while, I made the mistake of joking with her when she made a comment about me not picking up after myself. I said something like, "Every night I have to close the attic door behind you. How about you shut it all the way when you're done?" She then informed me that she hadn't been in the attic in months. Asked my brother, nope. Asked my father, nope. So then I started to pay really close attention to it, making sure it was closed in the morning, checking it after school, checking after dinner, then heading up to bed and open. After a couple months of wondering, studying, experimenting, I thought I'd see what happens if I just don't shut it. Opened the door before school and checked it after school. Still open. Checked it after dinner. Still open. Before bed. Still open. Now I'm laying in bed, mind going crazy with the open door across the room. Decided to check it out, so I roll over and focus on the black space into the attic to see a face staring back at me. Bolted downstairs, woke my parents, got ridiculed by my brother, switched bedrooms with him, and moved into a new house about 6 months later due to an expanding household. A new physics teacher and his wife bought our house. I could have forgotten all about that event and chalked it up to having an overactive mind. But then in my senior year, I discovered how awesome our physics teacher was. He became my favorite class and by far my favorite teacher. End of senior year, my friend and I took our VHS camcorder around town, doing mostly silly things, but then took it to my old house to see what they'd done with the place. We got a very fun tour. I got to tell stories about all the projects my dad did that were still part of the house. Then the wife leads us upstairs to show us the sewing room. I ask, jokingly, "Notice anything strange in this room?" And her face goes blank. On camera, she asks what I mean, and I try to shrug it off but end up saying something about the attic door. She confirmed that every time she comes up to sew, the attic door is open. She then tells us that on the second day of being in the house, their dog, a German Shepherd, had gone into the room but would not go back downstairs. He started barking and could not be consoled, then jumped through the window, landing on the tin roof over the porch and running off. The dog did not come back until the next day and has not stepped foot into the hallway that leads upstairs since. I had the initial thought that I could show my parents and brother the story I had on film, but I decided to just let it be. Storytime. In 1975, I was flying an Army helicopter doing night training in blackout conditions near Fort Hood, Texas. I was flying down a draw with a small seasonal creek in it, which was the new paradigm designed to mask the aircraft from Russian radar. I was at the controls, my co-pilot on the map. We were low and slow, treetop to treetop. Suddenly, I had the compelling, sure knowledge that I must do an emergency climb, which I did, climbing almost vertically. As I pulled the guts out of the aircraft and with my nose pointed up to the stars in my chin bubble, I observed the leaves of a cottonwood tree being pressed aside by the plexiglass of my chin bubble. After a couple of seconds and now a few hundred feet above the canopy, my co-pilot and I stared at each other with wide eyes and the knowledge that we had barely avoided death. "How did you see that tree?" he asked me. I never did tell him that I didn't, because I have never known how to explain it. I went on to fly helicopters for 37 years, accident-free, and I still can't explain what happened that night. Story 11. The house I grew up in was about 100 years old by the time my parents bought it. I lived there until I was 16. For as long as I can remember, I saw what I described as a girl that was pink and see-through. I always called her Pam. It's been 10 years since I lived in that house, and I still remember her vividly. My dad got a bit weirded out when I would talk about Pam, and finally, when I was 13, my mom put me in therapy because Pam was still something I brought up regularly. In order to stop my parents from thinking I was crazy, I just stopped talking about Pam completely and went on with life. That was until my parents decided to put the house up for sale when I was 16. Just 2 weeks before moving into our new house, I was sleeping, but was woken up by Pam standing in my doorway and pointing into the bathroom that was directly across the hall. All Pam said was, "Look, my mom." And when I looked to see who she was pointing at, I saw a woman hanging by a cord from the light fixture in the bathroom. I remember the woman looked as though she had been hanging there for a while, when all of a sudden the woman's boot fell off, and I abruptly woke up. I ran into my parents' room to tell them what happened, and my mom looked at me disappointed because I was talking about Pam again after having kept quiet about her for years. I concluded that it was just a bad dream and went back to bed with no other incidents, until a few days later. I was once again asleep and dreaming that I was woken up by crying coming from the bathroom across the hall. I got out of bed and walked over to see what was going on. At that point, I saw the same woman who was hanging from the bathroom light fixture, sobbing and holding a very real little girl under the water in the bathtub. It was then that I realized the little girl was the pink, see-through girl I had seen my entire life. It was Pam, and she was not moving. I immediately woke up and was crying uncontrollably. I was 16 years old and ran into my parents' room like a 5-year-old and jumped into bed with my mom. My dad was working at the time. I told my mom what had happened, and my mom could see how upset I was and was trying to calm me down. At that same moment, the pink and transparent version of Pam walked through the door. I looked at my mom and just whispered, "Oh my God, Mom, she's in here." And I pulled the covers up to my neck and just looked at my mom, terrified. My mom was speechless. At that point, Pam slowly walked up the side of the bed and began shoving me into my mom. I had never been touched by Pam before. I was screaming and crying and kept yelling, "Stop touching me!" And all my mom could reply was, "I'm not touching you," as she was being pushed out of the other side of the bed. After what seemed like forever, Pam stopped and slowly walked out of the room. I cried myself to sleep, and my mom stayed awake to see what else would happen. I never spent another night in that house. But 2 weeks after we moved out completely, the house caught fire. The entire backside, as well as the garage, burned. The official cause was spontaneous combustion. The house that my family lived in for 25 years has since been bought and sold 8 times within 10 years. No one wants to stay in that house, and I really think Pam is the reason why. Story 12. Hunter Mountaineer here. It was a chilly December morning. I hiked in pre-dawn, taking about an hour and a half to go 3 miles off the beaten trails. Got to my nest about half an hour before sunrise and started to settle in. The wind kicked up and a fog rolled in that was thicker than milk. Within a few minutes, my visibility was 5 feet. I'm sitting tight, huddled up against the freezing wind, when I start to hear twigs snapping close to me. For no apparent reason, what is normally a rapturous sound indicative of an imminent successful hunt sent a frosty chill down my spine. I chambered around in my lever action 30-30 as quietly as I could and lay flat on my back, tucked against a fallen tree. The rustling was moving closer through the fog, but I couldn't see anything. The sun was starting to peek over the mountains to my east, and visibility was starting to increase. The rustling of twigs and leaves was sporadic, sometimes directly in front of me, sometimes behind or beside me. I remember lying there, rifle across my chest, thinking to myself how silly it was to react like such a coward. I reasoned that bears and mountain lions are a rarity where I was, and I had likely stumbled into a herd of whitetail that had bedded down. I decided to sit up. The rustling stopped immediately. As it was fully dawn by now, I was looking through the fog for the outline of my prey, which I had assured myself was literally all around me. It wasn't. Seemingly, nothing was. By now, the fog had faded away, and it was apparent to me that I was alone in those woods. I hunted all that day without seeing so much as a squirrel. Around 3 in the afternoon, after fighting the wind and an abnormally cold day, and not wanting to hike out by flashlight, I decided it was time to start back to the truck. Walking out of those woods was the most uneasy I have ever felt. Lawfully, once you make it back to the trail, you're supposed to clear the chamber of your rifle. Not that day. What is normally a stroll through the woods I undertook with the seriousness of an animal being stalked. I would walk, then stop and listen. I never heard or saw anything during my retreat, but I could feel eyes on me. I was about 100 feet away from my truck when I rounded the last corner and saw, hanging at eye level from a tree by a noose, a stuffed bear in a blaze orange jacket. I'm a giant, broad-shouldered outdoorsman, but that one shook me something fierce. Story 13. A week ago tomorrow, October 20th, I came home from class at around 11:30, and no one else was home. I hung out at home for a bit, and at 2:30 I was overcome with sleepiness. Being the bum that I am, I laid down in my bed and set a timer on my phone for a 20-minute nap. I fell asleep quickly, and after around 5 minutes, I was woken up by my bedroom door opening and had a split second of panic before my dog jumped up onto my bed and lay down next to me. I fell back asleep. After another 5 minutes of sleep, I instantly jolted awake because I was certain there was someone standing next to my bed behind me. I assumed it was my mother, who would likely be upset that I was sleeping in the middle of the day. I woke and turned around in one movement, and there was no one there. Weird. I checked my phone and had another 8 minutes of sleep left. I went back to sleep only to be woken by my phone ringing. It was my mother. She said that my great aunt, who had been in the hospital after a stroke-like event for a week, had died around 1 o'clock. My mom then said she knew my aunt was going to die today because she had seen a wraith, a sort of ghost, usually warning of someone dying, that morning. My mom is Scottish and very superstitious, but I don't believe in any of that. She said that when she woke up that morning to take my brother to school, she went into my room to see if I was still asleep, and she saw a wraith standing next to my bed. My brain froze. Story 14. Family moved into an old house, 200 plus years, when I was 10. Uncle, weird guy, was going to help us move in, and when we got inside the house, he got all weird and left. He always avoided coming for birthdays, etc. We always joked he saw a ghost, and for some reason, we nicknamed the ghost Billy. When my little sister started talking, she would say really weird things, like asking if we could shut her door at night so she didn't have to see the boy walking down the hallway creepy. Anyway, we thought she was also just being a big weirdo, so we continued to have this Billy the ghost joke. Something would get misplaced. Must be Billy. A few years later, we ripped up the flooring because we wanted to go back to the original hardwood that had been covered up forever ago by old owners. And if you know anything about old houses, you know they used to insulate the floor with newspaper when newspaper had just become a thing. We decided to read some articles for fun, some talking about the first ever refrigerators, really cool things like that. Until we got to the creepy part. A mentally challenged boy named Billy who lived in our home died while playing outside of it. I saw a lot of weird things growing up in that house, but I'm not a huge ghost believer. The newspaper was a creepy coincidence, though, given that for years we had an ongoing Billy the Ghost joke. Uncle also ended up telling us years later that when he pulled into the driveway and was outside of the house, he just got this awful feeling. Story 15. I used to date a girl in college who lived 3 hours away. We would trade weekends, one at her school, one at my school. One day she got upset because she had driven all the way to see me, and I was in an all-night study session, which she had known about, and couldn't be home to see her. She texted me that she was going back to her place, and then I never heard anything from her ever again. After 3 days of texting her, trying to make sure she was okay, the text started coming back as number not found. I sent her the stuff she'd left at my apartment in the mail, and it was returned as no forwarding address. Her instant messenger account, which I never messaged but knew the name of, disconnected. And it gets weirder. I called her apartment landline and was told the people who had lived there had moved out. She had 3 roommates and didn't leave a number as to where they went. I got really freaked out and asked friends who worked in school administration to pull some strings just to make sure she was alive. The school she was at didn't have any records of her as a student. The license plate to her car wasn't registered to anyone. None of our mutual friends ever saw her again. I called the police, but there were no car accidents involving anyone who fit her description in the stretch of road between our 2 schools that night, or in the 2 weeks after. I didn't ask for a longer time frame because at that point she was already missing. Cops wouldn't file a missing person report because I wasn't a family member. To this day, I have no idea what happened, why she freaked out on me so badly, or if she's still alive or in witness protection or was erased from time by something unknown. She literally disappeared without a trace. Story 16. This happened 3 times with 3 different people. I grew up in a 2-story house in the Philippines. Upstairs, there was a huge playroom and 4 bedrooms. When I was around 11 years old, me and my babysitter were hanging out in the playroom. She went to the bathroom and I got bored, so I went downstairs to check out the fridge. I heard her come out of the bathroom and she started screaming my name. After the 3rd time, she stopped. I thought she figured out I was downstairs. After a few minutes, I saw her coming down the stairs. As she looked at me, she froze and just stared at me. I asked her what's wrong, and she said she had just seen me in the playroom before she went downstairs. She was really freaked out about it, and I didn't know. I used to not believe in these things, so I just laughed at her. The second time it happened, I was probably 16. I was hanging out in my brother's room because it had the fastest internet. Then I heard my 6-year-old brother, I have 2 brothers, calling me and looking around for me. I didn't answer back and just waited for him to find me. I saw him go into my room, and then he got quiet. I thought he was looking for something and just found it. As he was walking out of my room, he saw me in my brother's room, and he just froze and stared like my babysitter. I asked him what's wrong, and he said, "Why are there 2 of you?" And that's when I freaked out and ran to my mom's room. She laughed at us, but I remember sleeping in her room that night. The last time it happened was when I was 20. My parents went on vacation with my youngest brother, so me and my other siblings had to stay at our grandparents' house. The first night they were away, me and my sister decided to go home and get more clothes. We were both in my room because she likes to borrow some of my clothes, and I told her I was going to take a shower. That's when she left and went to her room to pack more clothes. I went to the bathroom and started brushing my teeth. As I was about to get in the shower, my sister walked into the bathroom, and she looked at me really weirdly. Her face turned pale, so I asked her what's wrong. She said she went back to my room and was talking to me, but then she had to pee, so she went to the bathroom and found me there. We both looked at each other, grabbed our stuff, and left. I still don't know why or what it is, but it still creeps me out when I think about it. Story 17. I posted this a long time ago, but when I was younger, my mom was dating this guy, who we'll call JB, and after a few months, he invited my mom, me and my brother to go with him and his son, about my age, out to his lake house for the weekend. It was right on Lake Michigan, but up in a more secluded area, which was pretty awesome. Well, we got up there, and for one, I already felt really creeped out. It was a smaller 2-story, maybe 3 if you count the really big attic, house that had the living room, dining room, kitchen on the first floor, and had 2 bedrooms on the second floor. His grandfather had helped build the place with his own father, and then he lived there for most of his life, working as a tailor in the nearby town. We went up to the attic to get some beach toys because that's where JB kept all that stuff, so he didn't have to haul it every time he went out there. When we went up to the attic, I noticed in the corner, covered in some dust and cobwebs, about 8 mannequins, some just upper torsos and some full body. Not too out of the ordinary, considering a tailor had lived there. Me and JB's son slept down in the living room on the couch since there were no more beds, and around midnight, I heard one of the stairs squeak a few times. Figuring it was my mom coming to check to make sure we were asleep, I told his son to be quiet and quickly turned the TV off and hid under the covers. After not hearing any noise for a few minutes, I looked out from under the covers and saw 3 of the mannequins moving around in the kitchen. Their body parts weren't moving, but they were sliding around the kitchen. I swore I was dreaming, but was so terribly frightened I hid back under the covers with a small yelp, and then heard the dragging on the floor coming closer. I peeked out and saw one of them just a few feet from the couch. I hid back under the covers and shut my eyes tight, hoping it would go away. The next morning I got up and tried not to think about it, really hoping it was just a bad dream. But when we went back up to the attic to put the beach stuff back, the mannequins were in different spots and weren't covered in cobwebs anymore. Don't believe me if you don't want to, but it happened, and I've been scared of mannequins ever since. Story 18. Around the time I was a sophomore in high school, my parents decided to tear down our house and rebuild, seeing as a lot of people in our neighborhood were doing the same for property value purposes. I had made multiple jokes about how cool it would be to get a secret room that no one knew about, but I didn't actually expect them to take adding it into consideration. Turns out they worked with the contractor and ended up having an area set aside. Basically, if you were looking inside my closet and turned right, you could walk to the corner where there was a 1.5-foot bar to hang clothes. If you moved those clothes, there was a wall behind that you could push open and bam, the hidden room, fully equipped with a ceiling light and electric plugs. Imagine how many games of hide and seek I won. No one ever found me. The room was my precious secret, and I wasn't going to share it with any person outside of my family. Unfortunately, after a few months passed by, I began to get tired of the room. First of all, trying to squeeze past all of the clothing proved to be a pain. Then I'd have to slide through the tiny space to get into the room, which wasn't all that big itself. The magic had worn off, so I stopped entering it. Fast forward to a couple of months later when things began to get weird. Our family had left for vacation for 2 weeks, so we had one of our neighbors take care of the house. We had been having a lot of crime in the area, so she occasionally stopped by just to check. When I had gotten back home, I was exhausted and wanted nothing more than to crawl into bed. Opening the door to my room, which was dark, I noticed that something was off. I could see a faint glow coming from underneath my closet door. Okay, I thought to myself, my neighbor must have been going through my stuff. So I walked over to turn off the light, only to realize that the closet light switch was facing down. Confused, I opened the door, and to my horror, I noticed that in the corner, all of my clothes had been shoved aside, the wall to my secret room had been pushed open, and the light was on. How was this possible? No one knew of that room other than my parents and the contractor. I stood there in utter disbelief for about a minute until I realized my neighbor must have really explored the place. I warily made my way to turn off the light, followed by putting the wall door back in its place and moving the clothes back to their normal formation. I'm going to try and explain what happened next as best as I can. Still kind of freaked out, or at least confused, I start to exit my closet. I'm standing in its frame, looking across my room into the corner, where I have an iron floor mirror. I'm looking at my reflection when I notice that the closet space behind me suddenly lights up and I hear this scraping noise. Or at least I think that's what it was. My heart had been pounding so hard that my ears could only hear the rush of blood with every beat. I just remember jerking my head back inside my closet to find that all of my clothes were moved aside, the wall was pushed open, and you guessed it, the light to the secret room was on. Once I was able to move from my petrified state, I convinced myself that I had been so confused when I had initially seen the secret room open that I had not really closed it back at all. But I know that I was lying to myself. Throughout the next few months, weird things kept happening. They weren't anything major, but still weird to the point where I couldn't explain it. For example, I would walk into my bathroom only to find that my toilet seat was being left up. Every single time. I was assuming my dad was coming into my room to use it, but that would mean he had a serious case of overactive bladder. When I approached him about it, he looked at me as though I were crazy and asked why he would use my bathroom when we had one down the hall. I couldn't answer that question. There were other instances when I would wake up in the morning only to find that, on multiple occasions, my closet door was wide open. Before any of you say that's not a big deal, let me clarify that I had been slightly terrified of my closet and made sure every night that its door was closed before I went to sleep. I would check to make sure I heard the click and pull back and forth a few times to prove it had been shut all the way. There was no reason it should be wide open, and there was also no explanation for why, occasionally, the light was turned on in the middle of the night. I know. Malfunctioning lights and toilet seats don't come off as scary, but bear with me. I was freaked out to the point that I finally approached my mom about it when we were both working in our downstairs office one day. Background story on her. She doesn't believe in ghosts whatsoever. In fact, she raised me and my older brother, who had moved out since we had lived in the new house, to think that any person who believed in ghosts was crazy. So when I tell her of my suspicions, I'm surprised when she sighs and says she's noticed weird things have happened too. I'm getting tired of typing. I'm not really a storyteller in the first place. So I'll try to wrap this up. She continued to tell me how when we first moved into our house, the one we tore down, she would always hear footsteps walking around in my brother's room. This would confuse her because he was at school every time this happened, but she could have sworn she'd hear him running around. One time when she had walked up, toys were sprawled across his carpet. This took her by surprise because he hadn't left his room like that before heading out. She then goes on to explain that the previous owners of the house had a young son that died in my brother's room, which is what led them to selling the house, which she never told me about before. I'm guessing she thought I was old enough to know now and not form any irrational stories about ghosts haunting our house. If that had been her goal, I hate to inform her that it absolutely did not work. At this point, I am now positive that our house is haunted. She wrapped up her story and laughed it off, as though it's silly to believe that there wasn't a logical explanation to weird things happening. The footsteps coming from the old house were because it was old. The lighting and toilet issues were stemming from the fact that the house was brand new. At that point, we swivel around in our office chairs and continue working on our computers. After a minute or so, I can hear this loud, almost white noise sound. I turn to my mom, thinking she was taking a break and watching some weird video, when I notice she's looking at me with the same confused face. "It sounds like your shower's running," she said. Our bathroom was directly above our heads. Our dazed expressions stem from the fact that my shower hadn't worked for a good month or so. New houses come with a lot of problems. Right as she said that, the water had stopped running, and things went silent right before we heard 5 loud footsteps. I just remember seeing my mom turn white and immediately bolt upstairs, past my dad who was sitting on the couch watching TV. I finally joined her, only to find that she was looking in my closet, under my bed, everywhere. She had tried to explain to my dad what she had heard, but he insisted it was some piping issue, and she eventually believed him. There was no way that was piping. I just kind of stayed upstairs, accepting the fact that something weird, but probably harmless, was occupying my room. Oh, and as I was thinking about everything that had happened, I realized that my current room is exactly where my brother's old room used to be. I know that's not how hauntings work exactly, but it makes for a better story explanation. Yes? Story 19. I grew up in the Great Pacific Northwest, in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains, under the shadow of Mount St. Helens in Washington State. It's a land full of myth and legend, mostly from the natives, but also a lot from the old-timers, the loggers, the trappers, the hunters, etc. One of my father's oldest and dearest friends, now passed on, was a local Native American who was one of the oldest of his nation. He was an adult before most of the towns in our area were settled by white people. His name was Charlie to us. I'm sure he had another native name, but I don't recall what it was. Charlie used to sit us down, kids and adults, and tell us stories. Some of the stories were tribal legends, some were things he swore happened to him in the woods, and some were tales passed down from other members of his tribe or from the fur trappers and miners of the late 19th century. As I got older, I began to realize that Charlie wasn't just pulling our legs with some of these stories. He genuinely believed them, and a few of them happened to me as I would wander out into the woods and investigate. The most obvious and easiest to prove was the ridge lights or mountain lights. Charlie called them by different names, and the locals to this day still tell stories about them. The lights, according to Charlie, had existed as far back as man had. They would appear around the mountains on clear nights and zip around in the air. One of the local legends said the lights were the spirits dancing and playing. I first saw the lights when I was a kid, and several times since then. To me, they fit the exact description of a classic UFO. Lights that appear to be some form of aircraft, flying in ways impossible for current technology. Incredible speeds, sudden stops, sharp turns. The last time I saw the ridge lights was in the mid-90s. I've noticed a distinct decrease in reported sightings since then as well. But for a while, the western foothills of the Cascades were a hotspot for UFO activity. Speaking of UFOs, it goes a bit further than just seeing lights. When I was a young kid, I woke up in the middle of the night in the little farmhouse we lived in to bright lights outside. They were multicolored and flashing, like police car lights, except I seem to recall there was green in there as well. I was curiously unafraid and walked out of my room, into the living room, the kitchen, and eventually into my parents' room. All the while, in all the windows, those bright lights were shining. I tried to wake my parents up, but they were sound asleep. I shrugged it off, went to bed, and woke up in the morning. When I brought it up to my parents, they dismissed it as a dream. I accepted that, especially because of one odd part of my story. I couldn't wake my father, and he was a Vietnam vet who normally woke up at the sound of a mosquito. The story would have ended there, if not for our drunken neighbor. Some years later, when I was a teen, I was talking with the now deceased neighbor's granddaughter. The neighbor himself was known as a drunken lout and storyteller of the first order. Anyway, his granddaughter was telling me about how he used to tell these crazy stories, and one day he swore up and down that aliens landed in his field and visited him in the middle of the night. I laughed and said, I think I would have seen that, as our yard connected to his field. She agreed, saying something like, you and your parents would have noticed a bunch of red, green, blue, and white flashing lights in your backyard 10 years ago. To be clear, I'm not saying I saw a UFO land near my house. I'm saying I may have seen lights that match the description of the lights on the supposed spaceship that allegedly landed in my unreliable drunken neighbor's yard. And then there is the big myth of them all, Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you call him. Do I believe he exists? Absolutely, even though I consider myself a man who puts science before superstition. Why do I believe in him? Because when I was a child, I saw the footprints. My father even has a plaster cast of one. That was my first encounter. The prints were on the edge of a creek bed in a small ravine on a piece of wild property my father owned. We found them while surveying the land with a hunter friend. My father insisted it must be Bigfoot, to which the hunter scoffed and said a man could have made those prints. To demonstrate this 6 feet 6 inches, 250 pounds hunter climbed on a nearby log, took off his boots and jumped down into the semi-soft ground. His size 12 feet made a half-inch indent in the earth next to the other print. The other print was a hand longer than the hunter's, and at least 1.5 inches deep. It also had an odd big toe. It was splayed to the side, kind of like a thumb. My dad consulted Charlie for advice. Charlie told him to leave Sasquatch be, and Sasquatch would leave us be. Charlie also told us how to know when Sasquatch was nearby. Nothing else would be, and sometimes you could smell him. He said if you could smell Sasquatch, it was time to get the hell out, because he was a lot closer than you wanted him to be. Anyway, as the years went by, we learned to just hike out of the woods if they got dead quiet and we didn't see any signs of other animals. Only twice do I think I smelled him. Both times it was a heavy, musty, almost moldy odor, like old sweat or wet dog. The second time, I was with a girlfriend. This was in my teen years, and I remembered something else Charlie had said. Never go into Sasquatch territory with a woman who was on her period, because he could smell that and would track her, according to legend, to find a mate. It was the first time I ever asked a girl if she was on her period. She was, and needless to say, she was quite embarrassed to answer that it was that time of the month. That's when I told her we needed to leave, now, and we started out of the woods. We both swore we heard sticks breaking and branches rustling behind us the entire way out. And we both had that terrifying pit in our stomachs you get when you know something is watching you. Story 20. Stationed in Erlangen, Germany between 1990 to 1993, but lived off-post in Nuremberg. I lived in a condominium on Dusseldorfer Strasse with my then-wife and 2 daughters. My oldest daughter, 3 years old at the time, would often come running into our bedroom crying and complaining about a monkey in her room. She didn't have any toys of monkeys or apes, so it was kind of baffling to understand her or her fear. Their bedroom and ours were across from each other down the hallway, and we could see directly into their bedroom from ours. One late night, sitting up in bed reading, I caught movement out of the corner of my right eye. Thinking one of my kids might be up, I walked to their room, but they were both asleep. I went back to my bed and book, and again, I noticed movement. I glanced over to their room from my bed, And that's when I saw what appeared to be the outline of a child as it walked into the bedroom where my daughters were sleeping. I launched out of bed and covered the distance between my room and theirs in maybe 4 leaps. Nothing. My daughters were both sleeping. This was mid-tour for me, so for the remaining year and a half, we all slept in our room. Story 22. I worked at a small-town pizza shop during my winter breaks in college. I was good friends with a married couple who picked up occasional shifts to supplement the income from their regular jobs. One time, we were swapping spooky stories, and they told me about one that had happened just a week earlier. The wife had been spending the evening visiting her sister way out in the country when a heavy snowstorm rolled in. The roads were slippery and visibility was terrible as she was driving home. At one point, it was so bad she didn't even see the railroad crossing until the lights started flashing and the gate almost crashed onto her hood. Luckily, she managed to skid to a stop barely in front of the tracks, right before the train came roaring by. When she got home, she was still shaken up and told her husband about the close call with the train and how the gate had almost crashed on the hood of her car. The next morning, her husband told her he wanted to show her something, and they went driving back toward her sister's house until they got to the railroad crossing. All that was there was an old-fashioned crossing sign. There were no lights and no gates. Story 23. Several years ago, I had an overnight babysitting gig. At about 11 p.m., I would arrive at my client's house as they were leaving for work. Their son was only 9 and already asleep long before I showed up, and all I had to do was sleep in the guest room. Since he was under 13, he could not be alone in the house, so I was just around to make sure the place didn't burn down, essentially. Pretty sweet gig. The only downside was that the house wasn't in too great of a neighborhood. One night, a few nights before Halloween, I got a call from the mom saying she had to leave a few hours early, asking if I could come in ASAP. I was on the other side of town but could easily be there in about 45 minutes. She had to leave right away, so the kid was going to be alone for about 35 to 40 minutes. But since it was kind of a dire situation, she said it was fine. It never happened before or after, so it wasn't a big deal. So I drove across town and made it to their place in decent time. As I was parked in front of the house and gathering my things to take inside, I saw a cat out of the corner of my eye. As I got out, this cat started rubbing against my legs, weaving in and out of them, and following me as I walked up the path. Now this family didn't have a cat. The son was super allergic, and I'd never seen one around before, even after working there for over a year. But I didn't think much of it at the time. As I walked past the gate in their front fence, this painter's van pulled up. You know the ones. White, no windows, super sketchy. The back door opened, and these two guys kind of hopped out and asked me for directions to the nearest gas station. I pointed them where to go, down 2 blocks, over 4, and the guy driving rolled down his window and asked if I could just hop in and show him. Remember the cat? He suddenly zoomed out from behind me, ran under the fence, and started making that horrible shrieking noise cats make when they're about to fight in the dead of night right outside your window. The cat didn't stop. This fluffy little guy launched himself at one of the men, climbed his leg like a tree, and started clawing the ever-loving crap out of him. The guy freaked out, started screaming, and he and his buddy dove for cover in the van, speeding off with the doors still open. Then, like it was the most normal thing ever, the cat walked right back up the pathway and came to sit at my feet. I pet him, kind of scared I was going to be next, but he just accepted the ear scratches and purred before bounding off toward the backyard. Weirdest thing, right? I honestly thought I was crazy, so I tried to push it from my mind. Yeah, well, it gets more bizarre. About a week later, a woman around my age and build ended up missing, and local reports mentioned seeing a white unmarked painter's van in the neighborhood. Of course, I called the police, and they came and took my statement, but I never heard anything back about it. I left out the part with the cat in my story, but I've always secretly attributed my safety that night to that strange cat. I never saw him in the neighborhood again either. I've never really had cause to share this story before, but with Halloween so near, it always comes to mind. One of the only other people I've told the story to was the mom, and she's convinced it was some kind of guardian angel. I don't believe in anything like that, but I really don't have a better explanation as to why it seemed I was saved from a kidnapping by a strange unknown house cat. Story 24. So this happened about a month ago. I live alone, and it is extremely rare that I ever feel nervous about being alone late at night. Well, one night I just had this incredibly uneasy feeling, So much, in fact, that even though I'm a smoker, I decided not to smoke before bed like usual. I checked the locks on all my windows and doors before going to bed. I laid down, but still couldn't shake this uneasy feeling. I got up and grabbed my pistol, a revolver, and placed it, still in the holster, on my nightstand next to the bed. I eventually fell asleep, and all was good, until I woke up the next morning and noticed my pistol sitting on the dresser. I thought, well, that's weird. I got up and went over to get the gun and realized that all of the bullets were missing. Since I live alone, I always keep it loaded, but the bullets were gone. I went and grabbed the box of ammo from the closet, and exactly 5 shells, the ones I had used to load the revolver, were missing. At this point, I'm freaking out, either thinking that I had maybe woken up in the middle of the night and unloaded the gun or something like that. Well, I had to get my day started, so I went and made some coffee. I needed to empty the garbage and took the bag outside to the can. As I started walking around the house, I froze instantly. All 5 bullets were scattered on the ground on the backside of my house. The weirdest part is that I hadn't left my house at all the previous day, and all the windows were locked when I checked them the night before. Story 25. We had just moved all the way from the West Coast to the Midwest. We had trouble finding a place to stay since we had such a huge family, so one of our uncles let us stay in the other half of his duplex. It was a 2-story giant house. Anyway, we, the kids, were playing in the basement at like 1 or 2 a.m., and we saw this door that we had never noticed before. We dared each other to open it, but no one would, since we were all scared. The next morning, we told my grandfather about the room. He went into the basement and opened the door, which was just a small room. But I remember it being really dark in there. The only light that came into the room was from us opening the door. He took a look inside, and I remember him saying, "You stay right there." Not talking to me, of course. He got my father, and they quickly went to the farmers and got a chicken. My grandfather was a traditional shaman, so he respectfully gave thanks to the chicken and killed it. The chicken blood was collected into a bowl. He got his shaman hat and finger bells. He put on the hat, which covers his entire face, and proceeded to open the door. With the finger bells, one in each hand, and the bowl of chicken blood, he went in and said some incantation and placed the chicken blood in the room. He came out and closed the door. Then he started doing his chants, and you could hear the bowl moving. It had this spinning kind of sound to it, and when it finally stopped, my grandfather opened the door again. As his chants grew louder, it also echoed more. We weren't allowed to see what happened in that room during the exchange, but his finger bells sounded like he was walking into a corner. He came out with the bowl that had a small amount of chicken blood left and what looked like a little hand-stitched doll with red twine around it, soaked in blood. I remember clearly the little doll was soaked. He took a match and lit the doll on fire in the bowl. He told my father to make sure to bring it outside and not let the fire die out until he got it outside. I still don't know how the bowl with the chicken blood was on fire. I doubt chicken blood would catch on fire, so the only thing I could think of was the doll. Once my father left, I got a look into the room, and you could faintly see that most of the chicken blood had splattered around. We had to clean it up later with flashlights because the room was so dark and the blood was smeared all over the walls. A few days later, in the middle of the night, I heard my mother and father panicking. There was a ton of smoke in the house. We went out of the room to check what was happening, and my father was running back and forth from the bathroom to get the pail of water to wherever the smoke was coming from. My mother gathered all of us outside and called the fire department. We all got outside except my grandfather was nowhere to be found. My dad quickly ran back into the duplex and, what seemed like a few hours later, came out carrying my grandfather on his back. Somehow my grandfather had his shaman hat on, which puzzled me. I asked my father a few years ago, after grandfather had passed away, about where he found him. My dad said the smoke was coming from near the basement stairs. He found my grandfather in a deep trance facing a wall. He quickly got my grandfather out of the trance and carried him out. It was strange since the firefighters said the fire must have suffocated itself because they couldn't find a fire at all. However, the walls in the kitchen and the basement were all smoked afterward. Story 26. I used to put in drop ceilings about 4 years back, and I was working at NC School for the Deaf. My buddy Kenny and I went in one Saturday morning to finish a few of the smaller rooms. I took the rooms on one end of the hallway, and he took the ones on the other. It was a pretty long hallway with medium-sized rooms, so we knew we wouldn't get it all done that day, but could get more than usual done since no one else was working on Saturday. I was cutting tile in my first room and could hear Kenny walking back and forth by the room I was in. After I finished cutting in the border tiles for the first room, I walked down to the other end of the hall to see how things were coming along. He proceeded to ask me if I was ever going to get to work, that I had just been making noise or grunting in the room next to him. Now keep in mind, this place was very empty. We had the keys and had to unlock it to get in. It all happened really quickly, but we both heard something run past the open door, and I swear I caught a glimpse of something. I have no idea what it was, but every hair on my body stood up, and Kenny said, "Leave your stuff and let's get out of here." It's kind of a locally known thing that the school is haunted, but man, I still get goosebumps thinking about that day. Story 27. The late father of my best friend encountered what we assumed to be a Sasquatch. He was on a fly fishing trip somewhere in the Ozarks with some friends, staying in a remote cabin just near the river. He said they were hanging out one night throwing rocks at trees when they started hearing noises in the direction they had been throwing. He said it just sounded like trees moving and sticks breaking, so he thought they might be disturbing a bear or possibly a big wolf. They headed back into the house to leave the animal alone. About an hour later, they were all woken up by a loud crash. They went outside to see a giant rock, about 400 pounds, that had been thrown at the front porch and damaged the wood. They got their guns and circled the house to check for any danger when my friend's father saw lots of movement in the trees and sound coming from just beyond the clearing. Still thinking it was a bear, I suppose, he yelled quickly in that direction and was answered with what he described as a huge yodeling bear. They went to bed and left the next day. Story 28. A few years ago, I was going for a bike ride down by the beach. They had just made new trails that went pretty deep into the woods and connected to the next town over. So one day I made my way down to the trails and started my bike ride. After a few minutes, I stopped to take a drink of water and noticed that the mosquitoes were out of control. I thought about turning around but decided that since they didn't bother me while I was riding, I'd be fine. I rode for another 30-ish minutes and came up to a sandpit where the path was supposed to be. It was by the beach, so lots of the paths had long stretches of sand that made it almost impossible to ride your bike through. But luckily, the sides of the path were matted down, so I could ride my bike along the edge. I started riding on the side and rounded the corner when I saw a woman further ahead of me pushing a stroller. I thought it was weird because we were so far out, and I almost never saw anyone, let alone a lady pushing a stroller. Plus, she wasn't even on the side of the path. She was trying to push the stroller right down the middle of the path in the deep sand. Pushing a stroller in sand is hard as hell, and I could see her struggling with it to keep it going. So I thought it was weird, but I stayed on the side of the path and kept riding closer, ready to pass. When I got probably like 100 feet away, she stopped and took one hand off the stroller and stretched it out to the side I was trying to pass on. I figured she was just making sure I didn't clip her or the stroller as I went by. So I squeezed past her outstretched hand and kept going. I rode for a while more until I came to another sand pit. This one was way longer and you couldn't ride on the sides, so I decided I'd just turn back. I stopped and thought about walking my bike through to the other side. But then the mosquitoes hit me again, and I realized it wasn't going to happen. So I turned around and started riding back. That's when I thought about that woman and her baby and how they must be getting swarmed by mosquitoes. But I kept riding. Eventually, I rounded a corner and saw the woman way ahead of me coming in my direction. I decided I'd tell her about the giant sandpit ahead in case she wanted to turn back. So I started riding closer and noticed her dress. It was basically in shreds, barely hanging on her. I got closer and saw she didn't even have a baby in the stroller. She was just pushing an empty stroller through the woods. At this point, she stopped moving and looked at me. Her eyes were open ridiculously wide, and her mouth was open too, showing her teeth. Then she leaned over to the side and stretched out her arm like before. But this time, instead of thinking it was to make sure I didn't hit her, it looked like she was going to try and grab me. I started freaking out in my head and thought about turning back. But the other way was just that long sand pit, and I didn't want to be caught in there if she was actually after me. I decided there was enough room to go around her arm and went for it. I rode as fast as I could past her side, all while she was holding on to the stroller with one hand and reaching for me with the other. I made it past and pedaled hard until I was out of the woods.